It was a cold Tuesday night, just after midnight, when Raymond pulled up in front of St. Vincent's Medical Center in his black town car. He wasn't sick. He wasn't worried. He was just there to check on a business partner who had come through a routine procedure earlier that day. The kind of visit that takes 10 minutes, involves a firm handshake, and gets filed under things a man of his position is expected to do. Raymond Cole was 58 years old, and he had spent the better part of 3 decades building one of the most respected real estate companies on the East Coast. He wore a coat that cost more than most people's rent. He had a driver. He had a personal assistant who managed his calendar down to 15-minute blocks. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms and immediately became the most important person in them, not because he was loud or arrogant, but because he carried the kind of quiet, settled confidence that comes from having worked extremely hard for a very long time and actually making it. He stepped out of the car and gave a small nod to his driver, telling him he'd only be a few minutes. The hospital entrance was bright under those flat white lights that hospitals always use, the kind that make everyone look a little tired and a little unwell. Raymond straightened his coat, glanced at his watch, and started toward the main doors. That's when he saw her. She was sitting on a concrete bench just off to the side of the hospital service entrance, not the main doors where visitors walked in, but the side one, the kind that staff used, tucked a little out of the way. She was still in her work uniform, a black apron, a white shirt that had clearly been through a long shift, a small name tag that caught the light just enough that Raymond could make out the letter D at the start of it. She was bent forward with her elbows on her knees and her face pressed into both hands, and she was crying. Not the kind of crying that comes with sound and drama. The quiet kind. The kind that people do when they've been holding it together for so long that the body just gives out when it finally finds a moment alone. Her shoulders moved slowly up and down. There was a cup of what looked like coffee sitting on the bench beside her, completely untouched, already gone cold. Raymond's first instinct, if he was being completely honest, was to keep walking. He was a private man. He respected boundaries. He knew that sometimes people needed to fall apart in peace, and the kindest thing a stranger could do was give them the space to do it. He took 2 more steps toward the entrance. Then he stopped. He didn't know why exactly. There was just something about the way she was sitting there, not dramatic, not looking for attention, not waiting for anyone to notice, that got under his skin in a way he couldn't shake. This wasn't a person having a rough evening. This was a person who had reached the end of something. You can tell the difference if you've ever been there yourself. And Raymond Cole, for all his wealth and all his success, had been there once. A long time ago. He remembered what it felt like to sit somewhere and not know how you were going to make it to the next thing. He turned around and walked toward her slowly, not wanting to startle her. He stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat gently. She looked up fast, the way people do when they've learned to always be alert, even when they're exhausted. Her eyes were red. Her face was tired in the deep way that goes beyond just needing sleep. She looked at him the way a lot of people in her position look at men in expensive coats who approach them in parking lots late at night, with immediate, practiced caution. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, already wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I'm fine. I was just heading back in." She hadn't been heading anywhere. Raymond could see that clearly, but he also understood why she said it. "You don't have to go anywhere," he said quietly. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." She looked at him for a moment, like she was trying to figure out his angle. What did this man want? Why was he talking to her? People who looked like Raymond Cole didn't usually stop for people who looked like her. A tired young black woman in a waitress uniform, sitting outside an A in the middle of the night. She had learned that a long time ago, and life hadn't given her many reasons to unlearn it. "I'm okay," she said again, a little softer this time. But her voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and that small crack said everything her words were trying to hide. Raymond didn't push. He didn't sit down uninvited. He just stood there calmly and said, "Take your time." And somehow, that simple sentence, so small, so ordinary, was the thing that broke through. Because nobody had said that to her in a very long time. Everyone in Deja's life needed something from her. Her kids needed her. Her manager needed her at the diner before the morning rush. Her landlord needed his check. Her little boy's doctors needed forms filled out and insurance information and follow-up appointments scheduled. Everyone needed her to be on time, to be ready, to be okay. Nobody ever told her to take her time. Her name was Deja. She was 29 years old. She had 2 children, a 7-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. She worked double shifts at a diner on 5th Street, the kind of place that was always busy but never quite busy enough to pay its staff what they were actually worth. She had been on her feet since 6 o'clock that morning. She had served hundreds of cups of coffee, cleared dozens of tables, smiled at customers who didn't always smile back, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, she had gotten a phone call that her son had been rushed to the emergency room. She had left her shift without finishing it, something her manager was not going to be happy about, and taken 2 buses to get to the hospital. Her son had stopped breathing properly at home. Her daughter had been the one to call for help because Deja had been at work, and her little girl, 7 years old, had somehow stayed calm enough to dial and explain what was happening. Let that sit for a second. A 7-year-old child calling for help for her baby brother because her mother was across the city trying to make enough money to keep the lights on. Deja's son was stable now. The doctors had gotten him breathing properly again, and he was resting inside. She knew he was okay. But then a nurse had handed her a paper, a preliminary estimate of what the visit was going to cost after her insurance. Processed what little it covered, and the number on that paper had walked her outside to this concrete bench where she'd been sitting ever since, trying to figure out how a person does the math when the math simply does not work. She didn't say all of this to Raymond right away. It came out slowly, in the careful, quiet way that people share things when they're not used to being listened to. And Raymond stood there in his expensive coat, in the cold, outside a hospital at midnight, and he listened to every single word. He didn't check his phone. He didn't glance toward the entrance. He didn't offer solutions or opinions or advice. He just listened. And by the time she had said as much as she was willing to say to a stranger, Raymond Cole was no longer thinking about his business partner upstairs, or his driver waiting by the car, or the early morning call he had scheduled for 7 a.m. He was thinking about this young woman on this bench, and the cup of cold coffee she still hadn't touched, and the quiet, unbreakable kind of strength it takes to cry like that and still sit up straight. Thought Raymond didn't ask her a lot of questions. He just let the silence sit between them for a moment. The kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable, but actually feels like a small kindness after a long and brutal day. The hospital sounds carried softly in the background, an ambulance somewhere in the distance, the low hum of the building's ventilation, the occasional automatic door sliding open and shut. Deja had stopped crying, but her eyes were still glassy, and her hands were wrapped around that cold cup of coffee like she'd forgotten it was there. Raymond slowly settled himself onto the far end of the bench, keeping a respectful distance, and looked straight ahead rather than at her, which somehow made it easier for her to keep talking. She told him a little more. Not everything, because she wasn't the kind of woman who handed her whole story to a stranger, but enough. She told him that her son, her little boy, 4 years old, the one who loved trucks and always fell asleep with one hand tucked under his cheek, had been dealing with asthma since he was 18 months old. She told him that the attacks had been getting worse over the past year, and that she had been trying to get him seen by a specialist, But the waiting list was long and the cost was high, and every time she got close to having enough set aside, something else came up. A car repair, a late utility bill, a week where the diner was slow and her tips barely covered transportation. Life had a way of doing that, of letting you almost reach the thing you needed and then pulling it back just a few inches further. She said all of this without bitterness, which is the part that struck Raymond the most. She wasn't angry. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was just stating facts the way someone does when they've been living inside a hard situation long enough that it starts to feel like simply the way things are. That quiet acceptance, that exhausted, matter-of-fact tone, was somehow harder to hear than if she had been furious. Anger, at least, has energy in it. What Deja had was something heavier than anger. It was the look of a person who had been tired for so long that they couldn't fully remember what rest had felt like. Raymond asked her one question. Just one. He asked her if she had anyone who helped her. Family. A partner. A support system of any kind. She was quiet for a second. Then she let out a small, short breath that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh, but was somewhere in between. She told him her mother had passed away 2 years ago. She told him the kid's father had been out of the picture since her youngest was still in diapers. She had a couple of co-workers at the diner who were good people, genuinely good people, and they had helped her out here and there when things got really tight. But they were all working the same long hours for the same modest pay, and there was only so much anyone could do when everyone around you was also just barely keeping their head above water. She had no family in the city. She had no safety net. She had her 2 kids, her 2 hands, and a work ethic that she had inherited from a mother who had spent her whole life showing up, even when showing up was incredibly hard. Raymond nodded slowly when she said that. He didn't offer empty words like, "You're so strong," or "I don't know how you do it." He had learned over many years that people who are actually carrying heavy things don't need to be told how heavy the load looks. They already know. What they need is something real, not admiration. Then she told him about the grocery situation, and that was the part that quietly broke something open in Raymond's chest. She mentioned it almost in passing, the way you mention something when you've almost stopped seeing it as unusual. She said that for the past few weeks, she had been eating whatever was left after she made sure her kids had enough. Not starving. She was careful to say that, as if she didn't want him to worry too much, but skipping meals more often than not. Stretching a pot of rice and beans across 3 or 4 days. Telling her daughter she wasn't that hungry at dinner, so that the little girl could have more on her plate. Her daughter had started to catch on. 7-year-olds are smarter than people give them credit for. The little girl had started eating less too, quietly, to try and match her mother. And when Deja figured out what she was doing, it had nearly undone her completely. A 7-year-old child rationing her own food to try and help her mother. Raymond sat with that for a long moment without saying a single word. He thought about his own life, not to compare, but because it was impossible not to when someone put something that real in front of you. He thought about the restaurants he'd eaten in that week, the meals he hadn't finished, the grocery runs his housekeeper did twice a week without him ever glancing at the total. He thought about all the times he had complained privately about minor inconveniences, a delayed flight, a slow contractor, a meeting that ran too long, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a while. Not guilt exactly. Something quieter than guilt. More like being suddenly sharply awake after walking around half asleep for longer than you realized. Deja wasn't done. She told him about the bill. She pulled the folded paper from her apron pocket and looked at it again, like she was hoping the number had changed since the last time she'd looked. It hadn't. $4,200 was what the preliminary estimate said she would owe after her insurance processed its portion. $4,200. She told him she had $312 in her checking account. She told him she had already borrowed small amounts from 2 different coworkers and felt terrible about it. She told him her landlord had given her a final warning about a late balance on her rent and that she had been lying. Awake at night, running numbers in her head that simply refused to add up no matter how many times she rearranged them. And through all of this, she sat up straight. Her voice was steady. She folded the paper back up and put it back in her pocket with the same quiet, careful dignity that you see in people who have decided, somewhere deep inside themselves, that they will not be broken by this, even when being broken would be completely understandable. That was the moment Raymond really saw her, not just as a woman having a hard night, but as a person of extraordinary character who had been placed in an extraordinarily unfair position. There is a difference between a person who struggles and a person who fights while struggling. Deja was the second kind. You could see it in everything about her. The way she spoke, the way she held herself, the way she was already thinking about getting back inside to be with her son rather than sitting here feeling sorry for herself. She had let herself cry for a few minutes in the dark because she needed to, and now she was already pulling herself back together. Raymond looked down at his hands for a moment. He was a man who had made thousands of business decisions over the course of his career. He had trusted instincts that most people would have questioned. He had taken risks that looked unreasonable from the outside and turned them into something solid and lasting. And every single one of those decisions started the same way, with a gut feeling that was so clear and so calm that it didn't feel like a risk at all. It felt like the only reasonable thing to do. He was feeling that right now. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small, plain business card, the kind that has just a name and a number. No title, no company logo, nothing flashy. He held it for a second. Then he turned to Deja and held it out toward her. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. And the expression on her face was the one that people wear when they have been disappointed enough times that hope has started to feel like something dangerous. But Raymond kept his hand steady and his eyes calm, and he waited. Deja looked at the card for a long moment without touching it. She had both hands wrapped around that cold coffee cup again, and she just stared at the small white rectangle in Raymond's outstretched hand like she was trying to read something between the lines that wasn't printed there. She had been in enough situations in her life to know that when something looks like help, it doesn't always turn out to be help. She had learned that lesson more than once, and she had learned it the hard way. And those kinds of lessons tend to stick in a place deep inside you that doesn't easily forget. "What is this for?" she said. It wasn't really a question. It was more like a quiet test. Raymond didn't pull the card back. He didn't get defensive or explain himself in a rush the way people do when they're trying to convince you of something. He just kept his hand where it was and said, simply, that he ran a foundation. That his late wife had started it years ago, before she passed, because she had believed strongly that working parents who hit an unexpected wall shouldn't have to face it completely alone. That the foundation had helped families in situations not unlike hers, medical bills, housing gaps, moments where the numbers stopped making sense and there was nobody in the corner. He told her that his assistant would reach out the next morning if she was open to it. That there was a process, a real one, not something made up on the spot. That nobody would ask her to do anything uncomfortable or be anything other than exactly who she already was. Deja listened to all of this without interrupting. Her eyes stayed on him the whole time, steady and searching, the way that people look at you when they're not. Just hearing your words, but watching your face to see if the words and the face match. She had developed that skill over years of navigating a world that hadn't always been straightforward with her. She was good at reading people. She had to be. He finished talking. The card was still in his hand. "I don't take handouts," she said. Not rudely, not with attitude. Just clearly, the way you say something that is simply a fact about who you are. I'm not offering one, Raymond said. Just as clearly, just as calmly. She looked at him for another long second. Then she looked back at the card. She thought about her son inside that hospital room, his small chest rising and falling under a thin blanket, a little plastic clip on his finger measuring his oxygen. She thought about her daughter, who was being watched by a neighbor right now, a kind older woman on their floor who had offered without being asked, because some people in this world are still like that. She thought about that piece of paper folded in her apron pocket with the number on it that didn't match anything in her bank account. And she thought about that pot of rice and beans at home that had 2 more days in it if she stretched it carefully. And she thought about her little girl quietly putting less food on her own plate so her mother could have more. And something about that image, that particular image, made her reach out and take the card. She took it slowly, held it in her fingers, and looked at it. It had a name, a phone number. Nothing else? Okay, she said quietly. Just that one word. But the way she said it carried everything. The exhaustion, the reluctant hope, the pride she was choosing to set aside, not for herself, but for her kids. Because that's what mothers do when they've run out of other options, and the only thing left to do is trust, even when trust feels terrifying. Raymond nodded once. He didn't make it a big moment. He didn't smile too wide or say anything that would make her feel like a charity case or a story to tell later. He just nodded the way you nod when something quiet and important has just passed between 2 people and both of them know it. Then he told her to get back inside to her son, that it was cold out, that the call would come before 9 in the morning. She stood up, tucked the card into her apron pocket alongside the bill, picked up the cold cup of coffee, and paused for just a second. She looked at him one more time, that same steady, searching look, and then she said thank you. Not in a big, overwhelmed way. In the small, real way. The way that means it. And then she walked back through that side door and disappeared into the brightness of the hospital corridor. And Raymond sat alone on the bench for a minute longer than he needed to, looking at the space where she had been. He went upstairs. He visited his business partner for exactly 11 minutes. He shook hands, said the right things, wished him a smooth recovery. And then he walked back out to the car and sat in the back seat and said nothing the whole ride home. His driver, who had worked for him long enough to know when not to talk, said nothing either. The city moved past the windows in streaks of light, and Raymond just sat there thinking about a folded piece of paper in a waitress's apron pocket and a little girl who had started eating less so her mother could have more. The next morning, Raymond was at his desk by 7. He had slept, but not deeply. He had woken up once in the middle of the night and lain there in the dark of a bedroom that was quiet and warm and larger than Deja's entire apartment probably was. And he had thought about the difference between the life he was lying in and the life she was living, and how that difference had nothing to do with effort or character or desire. She was working harder than most people he knew. She was showing up every single day for 2 children who depended entirely on her. She was doing everything that people are supposed to do. Everything that people get told will be enough if you just keep going. And it still wasn't adding up. That's not a personal failure. That's something else entirely. And Raymond knew the difference. He called his assistant before 8 and explained the situation. He gave her Deja's name and asked her to reach out before 9, just as he had promised. His assistant, a sharp, thorough woman who had been with him for over a decade and had processed dozens of foundation cases, asked the standard questions, wrote down what she needed, and made the call at 8:47. Deja picked up on the second ring. She had been awake since 6. She had gone home for a few hours after her son was moved to a regular room and declared stable for observation. The neighbor had stayed the night without being asked, without complaint. One of those small human kindnesses that holds entire lives together without ever making the news. Deja had showered, changed, made sure her daughter had breakfast, and then sat at the kitchen table with Raymond's card in front of her, turning it over in her fingers, going back and forth in her head about whether she was doing the right thing. She had almost talked herself out of it twice. That's how deep the instinct runs when you've been let down before. Even when something looks real, part of you keeps waiting for it to stop being real. But the phone rang, and it was the assistant. And the voice on the other end was professional and warm and asked genuine questions and didn't make her feel small or desperate or like a burden. And by the end of the call, Deja was sitting very still at her kitchen table with her hand flat on the surface and her eyes focused on nothing in particular, processing what she had just been told. The foundation was going to cover the hospital bill in full, all of it, the whole $4,200, gone, just like that. Not a loan, not a repayment plan, not something that would follow her around for years collecting interest while she tried to outrun it. Just handled. Because a man had stopped walking toward a hospital entrance and sat down on a cold bench at midnight and listened. She didn't cry right away. She sat there for a moment in the silence of her small kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and her daughter's drawings on the refrigerator and the quiet sound of the building around her. And she felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it. It was the feeling of being able to breathe,